Forgotten again. Afghanistan experiences one of its deadliest suicide bombings in 15 years as civilian casualties hit a record high. Also on today's program, a new normal for British diplomacy. We look at how Boris Johnson is already pushing the envelope as Foreign Secretary. And in Picture This, scorching wildfires demolish swathes of California. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. After years of international intervention, billions of dollars in aid, and a new era of democratic elections, the people of Afghanistan are still trapped in the horrors of war. It's a reality major political players could not have possibly imagined following the toppling of the Taliban in 2001. But for proof of the country's desperate state, the world can look no further than Kabul. Over the weekend, a twin suicide bombing ripped through the capital city, killing more than 80 people. It was one of the country's worst attacks in 15 years. Daesh claimed responsibility for that attack, solidifying concerns of a new emerging threat in the country, years deep in its war with the Taliban. Today's Newsmaker is Afghanistan, as we ask how the government can rescue the country from a perpetual state of war.
Chaos and confusion rule in the moments after a suicide bomb attack. There are desperate calls to loved ones and attempts to help survivors. None of this is new to Afghanistan, but the weekend attack claimed by Daesh was one of the country's deadliest in more than a decade. At least 80 people died.
We were holding a peaceful demonstration when I heard a bang, and then everyone was escaping and yelling. I saw many people were killed, and most of them were covered in blood. There was no one to help the victims.
The mostly Shia Hazara group were protesting to demand the government direct a major power line through their province. It was a planned demonstration. There was tight security, but it wasn't enough. This was the biggest attack Daesh has carried out in Afghanistan, and the first time it struck in the capital. And it could signify a dangerous turn on the country's road to stability. In the first 6 months of this year, Afghans have been hit with a series of attacks. The United Nations says 5,166 civilians have been caught up in the carnage, the highest figures since it started reporting the human cost in 2009. More than 1,600 have died, more than 3,500 have been injured, and children make up almost 1 in 3 casualties. Anti-government elements are responsible for 60% of the victims. But pro-government forces have also inflicted damage, mostly through combat. Which means Afghans are increasingly being caught in the crossfire from all directions. In the days ahead, the country is set for a new fight. The Afghan military says it's preparing for an offensive against Daesh in the country's east next week. But the Taliban remains the main obstacle to the country's stability. This month, US President Barack Obama pledged to keep 8,400 troops in Afghanistan through to 2017.
The only way to end this conflict and to achieve a full drawdown of foreign forces from Afghanistan is through a lasting political settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. That's the only way.
Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has called on the Taliban to join in peace and reconciliation talks, but so far there's no peace process. And with Afghanistan facing new threats, what cost will be paid by its people and the next generation who are growing up in the path of war? Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Kabul is Afghan journalist Bilal Sarwary, and also in Kabul is political analyst Fahim Dashty. Thanks both so much for joining us. Bilal, let me just start with you. Is this latest attack in Kabul claimed by Daesh an actual turning point here? Does it symbolize actually an entirely new chapter in the conflict in Afghanistan with the entry of a new militant group?
Well, if it is confirmed that it was carried out by Daesh, then it's extremely worrying because Afghanistan would be dealing with another deadly and brutal militant group. You have to remember that Daesh in Afghanistan is a recycled version of former Afghan and Pakistani Taliban commanders and some militant Pakistani groups. So the Daesh chapter for Afghanistan is a very different chapter than the one in Syria, let's say. But there are financial incentives. Daesh has become more of a lifestyle for people both in rural areas and some people in bigger cities, and they have been recruiting in universities and other urban areas.
Bilal, do you somehow doubt, perhaps, it is Daesh behind this?
No, what I'm saying is that you just have to ask some tough questions, you know. Where did Daesh get fighters from? Who are these people who are fighting? Some very basic questions. Al-Baghdadi was here in Kabul under the Taliban, there's no doubt. When Afghanistan was a hotel without a reception under the Taliban in the 1990s, all these jihadi figures, people from faraway lands were here. So I'm not surprised on that front. What I would like to see is evidence of connection between Daesh in Afghanistan and Daesh in Syria.
Okay, Fahim, I'd like to get your take on what you heard from Bilal.
Oh, I think my friend Bilal is absolutely right in regard with the comparison of Daesh here in Afghanistan as well as in Middle East in this regard. But when it comes to your question, if this is a turning point or not, I do believe that this is not. Why? Because the demonstrators announced the date of demonstration weeks ago, and that made them a very soft target for the either terrorist groups active in Afghanistan, including Taliban or Daesh, whoever have done this attack. And the security arrangement was very tight, but it was almost impossible to avoid such an attack because 5,000–6,000 people coming from 5,000–6,000 different homes, and 1 or 2 or 3 terrorists are entering this wave of the people, it was unavoidable. This is why I don't think that this single attack will make something real big turn in Afghanistan, but it was a very sad incident.
Let me ask this. We've heard it said, particularly in the last year and a half when the refugee crisis came to the fore, that somehow Afghanistan became the forgotten conflict in a sense, that it was really being overshadowed by conflicts in Syria and Iraq. Will the event of Daesh's potential infiltration in Afghanistan focus more international attention back on the country, Bilal?
Well, I think that seems to be true in some cases. First, you have to see when Mullah Omar was elusive, no one really heard from him, and there were rumors that the former Taliban leader was dead. There was a leadership crisis within the Taliban. Some people within the Taliban were simply asking, well, where's Mullah Omar? And for a jihad, you need an emir. This is when Daesh started exposing that weakness, and there were efforts to fund certain Taliban leaders and commanders. So yes, there was evidence of money coming in some cases. Daesh was also trying to recruit some people from universities. For example, a girl from Nuristan was recruited via Facebook, and she was taken all the way from here to Syria. So we know that they've got contacts. Logistically, they can do things on that level. But do I believe that Daesh really exists the way it does in Syria? Do they have a military muscle? And are they really the fighters of al-Baghdadi? I think you have to really start asking the question, who are these people who are making up this Daesh front in Afghanistan? They're simply former Taliban leaders and commanders and members of the militant groups in Pakistan like LET, Lashkar-e-Taiba and others. And let's also not forget that we have seen a much more brutal, a much more militant Taliban as well. So you just have to then start asking the question, well, which one of these groups is more brutal, you know? But Daesh in Afghanistan the presence of Daesh in Afghanistan would obviously scare Washington and London and other Western capitals. Now, that being said, the American officials are now more worried about what they say a resurgent Al-Qaeda members or Al-Qaeda fighters and commanders coming back because they have had a very close relationship with the Taliban. And I think that is something that is scaring the American officials as well as the Afghan government.
Fahim, you seem to agree. You have the same questions, really, as Bilal does. But I want to ask you as well, just the idea of Daesh having infiltrated Afghanistan, do you think it will focus renewed attention from the international community on the country, perhaps help provide more assistance for Afghanistan, assuming that's even what Afghanistan needs, assistance from the outside? Go ahead.
When you said that if Afghanistan is a forgetting land, I cannot agree with this, because we were experiencing this forgetting land during the 90s in Afghanistan when Mujahideen came in power, and nobody was care about Afghanistan, neither the East nor the West. But after 2001, the case was different. But when it comes to now, I think the conference in Warsaw, the NATO conference in Warsaw just weeks ago, and another one which is coming up in the October in Brussels, it shows that no, Afghanistan is not anymore a forgetting land. There is attention to Afghanistan, but of course, with what's happening in Middle East, some focus has been turned to Syria and Saudi Arabia or other countries of the Middle East. But it doesn't mean that the focus from Afghanistan was decreased. I think there's enough support for Afghanistan, and I do believe that the government of Afghanistan as well as the security forces of Afghanistan are quite capable to deal with the challenges and problems they are facing.
Okay, so perhaps it's not forgotten, arguably overshadowed. Nonetheless, Bilal, let me ask you, what kind of help do you think Afghanistan needs from the outside? Or is it simply a question of the Afghan government performing better and the Afghan security forces doing the job on their own?
Well, look, I think the world came to Afghanistan after the attacks of 9/11. They paid a price for ignoring Afghanistan in the 90s. They left Afghanistan when there were no more Russians in Afghanistan. So I think that's very clear why the world came. But since the removal of Taliban in 2001, there has been this catalog of errors, both on the part of the Afghan government and on the part of the international community. Taliban were removed from power, but they were not finished. They went first into rural areas. Their leadership went into neighboring Pakistan. The Quetta Shura was inside Pakistan. And I think this was one of the sticking points between Islamabad and Washington, because Pakistan at no point up until now really went against Taliban leadership or their financial networks. Pakistani cities are host to senior Taliban leadership. Inside Afghanistan, mistakes were made when villages were bombed, when the Americans went after killing a Taliban commander, let's say with 100 fighters, and usually what we saw were civilians getting killed, so that was one problem. The Iraq invasion happened, so that hijacked all the resources and the attention from Afghanistan. There was less focus on building an army, a police force, so nation building was not really happening. And it was only when President Obama started coming into power, I think we saw more and more resources. But again, the problem of Pakistan was not addressed. At home, corruption was a big problem. The culture of impunity was a big problem. So, I think who suffered were the Afghan people, because they were often living in a village where, they had to go through brutality, whether it was at the hands of Taliban or a militia group. The government was simply not there. Even basic services were really not there. But if you compare the Afghanistan of 2001 to now, it's a different world. Afghans have more access to education, more access to health. Millions of Afghans have access to cell phones. Afghan airports are connected to the rest of the world and to the rest of the region. I think Afghanistan's journey since 2001, or the journey of its people, is one that's a fight for peace. And this fight is becoming increasingly more and more costly, mainly because everyone here in Afghanistan would tell you that the root causes have not been really tackled. That's the leadership in neighboring Pakistan, and then you've got a government here that's really struggling, whether that's appointing ministers of interior, defense in the last, let's say, 2 years, this government, or that's dealing with the issue of corruption in the last 14 years, dealing with a culture of impunity. So I think it's a variety of reasons. And now that the world has made this investment with blood and treasure, and so have the Afghans, you have to ask the question, how do you protect these gains? Could you really afford leaving Afghanistan again? What would that mean? Would that mean a comeback of Al-Qaeda and other jihadi groups? What sort of threat would that pose to the region and to the security of the world?
Fahim Dashty and Bilal Sarwary, thank you so much both for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Boris's big debut. A look at how Britain's new foreign secretary is faring during international crises. And in Picture This, burning with a vengeance, wildfires engulf Southern California. It's only been just over a week into Boris Johnson's term as British Foreign Secretary, and he's already making waves. On Friday, he was criticized for prematurely labeling a shooting in Munich as Islamic terrorism, which German authorities quickly dismissed. Sandra Gatman has more on how the face of Brexit is faring so far.
He's a man famous for his many blunders as former mayor of London. But as the UK's newly appointed foreign secretary, the British public might be less forgiving of Boris Johnson. On his first visit to the United Nations, he prematurely blamed what he called Islamist terrorists for the killings in Munich, although the suspect had no terrorist links.
We have a global phenomenon now and a global sickness that we have to tackle both at source in the areas where the cancer is being incubated in the Middle East, but also, of course, around the world.
He's already been forced to defend his history of gaffes at a news conference with his U.S. counterpart John Kerry. Boris once accused President Obama of being a half Kenyan and having an ancestral dislike for Britain. He's written an obscene limerick about Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and described a boycott of Israeli goods as a movement by corduroy-jacketed, snaggle-toothed lefty academics.
Yeah, I think we could all spend an awfully long time going over lots of stuff that I've written over the last 30 years. There are some serious issues, and all of which, in my view, have been taken out of context, but never mind. There's some serious issues before us today.
You were unhappy about you being Foreign Secretary?
Day one for the new Foreign Secretary was already an uncomfortable start. Social media was rife with criticism of Theresa May's decision to give him the job, only weeks after he pulled his bid to become Prime Minister. When it comes to global affairs, Britain has long been considered a reliable player. Diplomats will look to Mr. Johnson to keep up sanctions against Russia and military pressure on Daesh in Iraq. Mr. Johnson now faces the task of designing Britain's new role outside of the EU, a path he endorsed but says won't lead to isolationism. Johnson has played ambassador before and received a lot of credit for putting Britain on the world stage during the 2012 Olympics. But all eyes are now on his foreign policy as he joins the world's top international forum, a very different kind of show. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is journalist and politician Suzanne Evans. She's also the parliamentary spokesperson for the UK Independence Party. Suzanne, thanks so much for joining us. All eyes now on his foreign policy. Will it be this hawkish Britain first and only first, or do you think he'll assume a more conciliatory tone given the sensitivity of his position as foreign minister?
What people forget about Boris Johnson is that he is actually a great internationalist. He himself is of Turkish ancestry, with some French and Russian Jewry thrown in. He was born in the United States of America. He's lived there. He's also lived in Belgium. He's travelled all over the world as both a journalist and a politician, and of course as mayor of London. And he is arguably one of the most popular mayors of London that this country's ever had. He is very popular here, very popular indeed, one of the most trusted politicians that we actually have. I think actually making Boris Johnson Foreign Secretary is an inspired move, and I think he'll be very, very good at his job.
Suzanne, I've heard that before, this internationalist background that he has, but this position is about diplomacy. And when you have a foreign secretary saying things to people like Vladimir Putin, that he is a ruthless and manipulative tyrant, that, as you know, he wrote a very offensive poem about the president of Turkey. I understand that British politicians and American politicians might have thick skins. They're used to being made fun of in their respective presses. But when it comes to countries like China, Russia, and Turkey, there are sensitivities that he doesn't seem to respect. Do you not think that could be a problem for the UK?
Well, I disagree that he doesn't respect them. I think there is a difference between being a journalist, as Boris was in the past, and being effectively a minor politician on the world stage, and actually then stepping up to the plate to be in the role of Foreign Secretary. I'm sure there isn't any one of us that couldn't look back at some point in our past and say, oh, I really wish I hadn't said that. It perhaps wasn't the best thing. It will come back to haunt me. But I don't think, honestly and truly, that's something that should be held against Boris. For every one person who I think looks at a joke that he's made in the past and thinks, that really wasn't very sensible, I think there are probably 100 more people who are actually clamouring to meet him.
Okay,
Boris is going to be the...
now he is Foreign Secretary. You can say he made those gaffes, or whatever you want to call them, while he was a journalist, but he is Foreign Secretary now, and just days into the job, he immediately made a point of saying that the events in Munich were about Islamic terrorism before the Germans had even had a chance to investigate. That is not diplomatic.
No, it probably wasn't diplomatic, and I'm sure Boris would be the first to agree that perhaps he's learnt a lesson from that. But to go back to what I was saying, Boris is going to be possibly the most internationally recognisable Foreign Secretary that this country has ever had. And let's not forget one of the main reasons why I suspect our new Prime Minister Theresa May made him Foreign Secretary is because Boris was right at the forefront of the campaign to leave the European Union. Now, clearly the Foreign Secretary is going to have a critical role to play in smoothing that process. The Foreign Office is going to have to deal with the impact of Britain leaving the European Union, and we need to have somebody in charge there who is 100% behind the process and can help inspire confidence in that process and also represent Britain outside of the European Union on the international scale. And that, I suspect, is one of the main reasons why he got the job. That, and as I say, the fact that he is recognisable, the fact that I gather he speaks at least 6 different languages, and the fact that he is somebody who can very quickly take their place on the world stage, get a foot in the door, be well known straight away, and actually begin to build those very sensitive diplomatic relationships, building on the reputation that he already has, that positive reputation. Okay,
Suzanne Evans, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for sharing your insight on the Newsmakers. In today's Picture This, firefighters in drought-stricken California are battling a wildfire that's burning across nearly 130 square kilometers. But a scorching heat wave and winds of up to 50 kilometers per hour are hampering their efforts. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker was Afghanistan, as we asked how the government can rescue the country from a perpetual state of war. A new UN report says civilian deaths and injuries have already reached a record high this year. Over the weekend, a twin suicide bombing ripped through the capital city of Kabul, killing more than 80 people, one of the country's worst attacks in 15 years. Daesh has claimed responsibility, confirming concerns of a new emerging threat in the country with old consequences for its people. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.